just let you come up to the podium. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Lissy Medvedow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Center, with my colleagues, Professor Mike Cassidy and Hillary Balicki. Thanks for being here. We're very honored to have Congressman Seth Moulton here. Those of you who know us at the Rappaport Center, you know that our mission is twofold: to convene thought leaders and experts and practitioners to bring significant public policy issues to the forefront. And to do that, we have conferences and forums and symposia. And we also help develop public policy leaders through our fellowship program. And for those students, law students here, who are not in your final year, I encourage you to come on November 2nd at noon to Barrett House to hear our informational session about applying to become a Rappaport Fellow. It's a wonderful program. Two of my former fellows are sitting in the audience, and they can attest to it will provide you with a very enriching experience. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Congressman. He was born and he was raised here in Massachusetts. He stayed here for college, going to Harvard, the school across the river, and was a physicist, or at least graduated with a degree in physics. And after graduation, he entered the Marines, clearly a life-changing, transformative experience, and he served 4 tours in Iraq. When he came back, he went back to Harvard, getting a Master's of Public Administration at the Kennedy School and an MBA at Harvard, which maybe in BC parlance would be the equivalent of a triple eagle. I'm not sure, so maybe a triple crimson. I don't know if they have that at Harvard. The congressman then went to Texas, interested in transportation, and worked as a managing director of Texas Railway, helping to build a high-speed rail between Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. And then he came back here to the Commonwealth, where he started a healthcare company with one of his business school classmates. In 2014, he was elected. He ran against an 18-year incumbent in a primary, and he won. It was the first time an incumbent had lost a primary for a Massachusetts House seat since 1992. And he ran on a platform that clearly resonated for many, that of bipartisanship. And that has remained really his signature platform. He is trying to reach across the aisle and break the logjams that we all know are happening in Congress. He works on issues of great significance to those of us here in the Commonwealth, as well as to everyone in America, and just a few of them, including but definitely not limited to veteran services, immigration, gun control. He's been very, very strong and public about gun control, affordable housing. We just had a conference last Friday, full day, on access to mortgage credit for low-income people, national security and foreign policy. He's currently a member of 3 House committees: the Armed Services, Small Businesses, and Budget. He speaks from personal experience about many of these issues, as you can imagine. He's very popular. He's so popular, he's running unopposed in November, which is pretty fabulous. I'm not sure what it says about democracy. That's one of my questions to you, actually. The congressman cares deeply about his district, which is the 6th district, the North Shore, but he also cares deeply about the citizens of Massachusetts and the citizens of the United States. After he shares some remarks, he is happy to take questions from all of us. We've kind of figured about a half an hour, give or take some, for remarks and then questions. We hope that, given the fact that it is virtually 1 month exactly before the election, that we all have questions. Now's our chance to ask a sitting U.S. Congressperson, if I could say that, U.S. Congressman Seth Moulton. My privilege to welcome you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming out, and I really do look forward to your questions. How many veterans are out there? A few? Thanks, guys. I was an infantry officer in Iraq. I was in the invasion, and actually in the first company of Marines into Baghdad, but shortly thereafter I got this job, a very strange job for an infantry officer, working with the Iraqi media. I was put in charge of a TV station, a radio station, and a newspaper in south central Iraq. This is back when there was no plan whatsoever for the occupation, so they were just taking lieutenants to do whatever needed to get done. And it was a fascinating job because we had to teach these Iraqis the principles of a free press. I mean, they had lived in a society that was, all the news they got was from the Ministry of Information in Baghdad. And so we were teaching them how to put together news broadcasts, how to write a newspaper. But the first thing these TV guys wanted is they just wanted to be able to put something on TV because they no longer had the flow of tapes from the Ministry of Information and people wanted to watch. So we got them a DVD player, a little cable, and hooked it up to this massive transmitter. And these Iraqi engineers would sit around at night watching American movies for the first time in their lives while simultaneously broadcasting them to millions of Iraqis across the country. And among the many mistakes that guys, young 23-year-old second lieutenants made in those days, I should have explained the rating system to them. Because what would happen is they'd put in an American film and get to a sort of racy section and then have to quickly hit eject. And they had a 10-volume set of Islamic history videos that they would then put in to sort of ameliorate the population. So one night they didn't, they apparently fell asleep at the switch and didn't eject the movie quickly enough. It was apparently basic instinct. And the next day there were literally protests out in front of the provincial capital. We received death threats, men were throwing rocks, women wailing in the streets, the governor was irate, my battalion commander basically took the side of the governor. I had no practical control over what these Iraqis were doing in the middle of the night, but nonetheless it was my responsibility, which is a great lesson in responsibility. And so at the end of a very long day, getting berated left and right, my translator Mohammed and I decided, we just need a break. So we said, let's go down and hang out with the Iraqi police and get some tea. Because these are guys, mid-20s, early 30s. Surely they couldn't have been so offended by what was on TV last night. But I walked into a room about half the size of this, but with as many people, all young Iraqi policemen. And they were absolutely irate. They were yelling and screaming at me. I turned to Mohammed and said, Mohammed, what are they saying? And he said, sir, they say every time you put a movie on TV, you turn it off right when we get to the good part. So we literally couldn't please anybody. And it's a long way of saying that I don't know exactly what you want to hear, but I would love to hear your questions. And frankly, we can talk about whatever you'd like. I'll make my introduction pretty brief. I'm going to talk about three things. Just my sort of path to doing this, why I decided to take this job, this principle of bipartisanship, and why I think that we need to do more of it. And then I'll just talk a little bit about a specific issue just to give you a flavor of how the debate is going in Washington today, and I'll talk about guns. So first of all, for me, I did not grow up wanting to be a politician. I was not in the political club at school or anything like that, Democrat or Republican. I'd never volunteered on a campaign before. I'd never been an intern on Capitol Hill. But when I was in the war, I felt like I saw some of the consequences of failed leadership in Washington and failed decision-making. And there was, in fact, a day in 2004, at the end of a tough day, where a young Marine in my platoon came up to me and said, sir, you ought to run for Congress someday so that this shit doesn't happen again. Now, I didn't at that moment decide to run for Congress. I got out, I went to business school, moved down to Texas, actually. I mean, if I really wanted to run for Congress in Massachusetts, I would not have moved to Texas. And then I was recruited, though, by this nonprofit, this new nonprofit called New Politics that's trying to get service veterans to run for office. And not just military veterans, national service veterans, so Teach for America, Peace Corps, City Year veterans. And they called me up when I was living in Dallas and said, you ought to give this a shot. I said no. We went back and forth. They convinced me to take a look at it. And ultimately, I decided to take on this incumbent, who was my home district congressman, and I just thought that we could be doing a better job. It was a tough race. Running against an incumbent in your own party is sort of frowned upon by the political establishment. I mean, if you think about it, these guys were basically telling me, people who every single day came up to me and said, you're going to lose this race, and even just by running, you're giving this guy a hard time, you shouldn't be doing that, it's not being a good Democrat or whatever else. They're essentially saying to me, do not participate in this democracy that you risk your life to defend. And that's not healthy for our democracy, no matter how you look at it. But it was a tough race, and a lot of these people who said I would probably lose were right. We did our first poll after I'd been campaigning for about a year, and I was down by 53 points. So that's not too good. And the worst part, though, is that when you do a poll like that, it's not just about where you stand. Frankly, we hadn't started, running any ads, so a lot of people didn't even just didn't even know who I was. You want to look at the sort of your pathway to victory. What are the arguments that work for you, that work against him? How do you get to 50%? And my pollster, who was one of the best in the country, came back to me and he said, "It's statistically impossible to win this race." He said that you should quit. I should quit. And my campaign manager agreed with him, so I fired the campaign manager. Put actually a guy in charge who was a fellow veteran, literally the lowest guy on the totem pole, my driver. But I knew that he was a leader. And at that point, we'd actually gotten a lot of the infrastructure in place. We needed someone to make it happen, to rally the team, to get it done. So I put my driver in charge as the new campaign manager. And we came back from that 53-point deficit and won the primary. But when political scientists look back on this race, they say that in some ways what was most remarkable is not that I was the only Democrat in the entire country in 2014 to defeat an incumbent in the primary in the House of Representatives. So that's unusual. But perhaps even more unusual is the fact that I did it by running to the center. You win most primaries in America today by being a Tea Party guy on the right or someone on the far left. But I ran to the center, and I said that the fact that the incumbent was so partisan, that he's totally unwilling to work with the other side, is why he wasn't getting anything done. I mean, he passed one bill in 18 years. And that argument actually resonated even in the Democratic primary in Massachusetts. And then, of course, I just had the same argument in the general election. And so that's kind of how I got here. And I didn't know much about the job itself. Thought long and hard about whether it was the right decision to run. Didn't know much about the job itself before I got into it, but I do like it so far. I've been surprised by the fact that you don't have to just deal with the politics. You can really get into the policy. You can make decisions based on what's right, not just based on what the politics of the moment are, if you're willing to do that. I've also been impressed by how much you can do as a freshman in the minority party. A lot of people said to me, "Seth, you might get there, but you're not going to have any influence." And that's not true at all. You have to work harder than everybody else. You have to pick your battles, but you can make a difference, and I think we're doing some great things in my office so far. And one of the things that we're working on, which is an issue that I know matters to a lot of the legally minded folks around here. I mean, I'm one of the only members of Congress without a law degree, so that's something we don't have. Well, we all have in common right now, right? So, guns is an interesting issue because what people like me are advocating for in Congress is totally bipartisan. 9 out of 10 Americans believe that we ought to have universal background checks on guns. Now, we can have a great debate on whether we should get rid of the Second Amendment, but that's not what I'm advocating for. I'm saying preserve the Second Amendment, but just have some common safety, some common sense safeguards. Make sure that if you buy a gun, you have a background check. Make sure that terrorists who are not allowed to fly on airplanes in the United States are also not allowed to buy guns. And 9 out of 10 Americans, Democrats and Republicans, people across the political spectrum, agree on this, and yet we can't get it through Congress. So there was a little bit of progress made after the terrible tragedy in Orlando. You've probably heard about the sit-in and whatnot. I actually introduced one of the no-fly, no-buy bills into the House shortly thereafter. It's actually pretty easy to introduce a bill. That's kind of you just sign some papers and whatnot. What's much harder to do is introduce a piece of gun legislation with a bunch of Republicans. But that's exactly what I did. I got Republicans to cross the aisle on this piece of legislation. And I stood out in front of the steps of the House for a press conference right next to a fellow Marine veteran who said, "I'm a Marine, I'm a lifelong member of the NRA, and we got to do this because it's common sense." The problem is that the Speaker of the House is basically controlled by the Tea Party right now. And they simply won't let these things come to a vote. It's the same thing with immigration reform. Speaker Ryan himself has said that he supports comprehensive immigration reform, and yet he won't bring the Senate passed bill, to a vote in the House because of the influence from the far right. So it's an interesting issue because of the the politics on the surface, that it's just a politically divisive issue, is not actually representative of what's really happening with the politics in Washington. In fact, most people think that if my bill were to come to a vote, a lot of Republicans, enough to pass the bill, would vote for it, even though they don't want to come out publicly and support it now, because it just makes sense and it's actually supported by people in their districts. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor for, I mean, it's, I guess, an example of something that's a little bit more frustrating, but that's kind of a flavor for the politics of the moment in Washington around a particular issue. But with that, I'd be delighted to turn it over to you and take your questions about absolutely anything on your mind. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Congressman. My name is Mark McLean. I'm a native of the 6th District, Reading specifically.
Fantastic.
For you, 2014. Also a Navy veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom and share similar experiences to you. My question actually is about gun control. You've come out strong the past year in the wake of national tragedies for bipartisan, common sense gun reform. The specific provisions you're looking for, no fly, no buy, closing the gun show loophole, and famously came out in the New York Daily News saying the AR-15 is a military-only weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, I find all those reasonable points of view, but as a veteran and firearm owner, I know a lot of people think of gun rights as a war of attrition, one that will be won or lost incrementally.
Right.
And see giving into those three provisions as a path towards overall losing your second privileges. So while I find those three things reasonable, I wonder if those three things were made valid in congressional legislation in the next few years, where would you fall on, say, imposing the Massachusetts 10-round mag limit nationwide, as it was in the Clinton era, or restricting weapons to hunting only? Other things that certainly people on the left are calling for and would like, but we're not at that stage yet. And do you see incrementally pushing further left on gun control?
Well, you're right. I mean, that's basically both sides feel. You give an inch and they'll take a mile. And that's exactly why there's such a standstill right now. You know, personally, I think limits on magazine size make sense. I don't think sort of trying to limit to hunting only is practically something that can be really achieved. So I think that, you know, my own views kind of fall somewhere in the middle there. But you know, it's interesting. I mean, this is definitely, it's frustrating because there are, like you said, a lot of people who find these things pretty reasonable, but just don't want to make any progress whatsoever. That any sort of, you know, progress against the NRA's stranglehold on the right now, or frankly on the most Republicans, is going to be the start of a very slippery slope. I don't think that's really fair, because the reality is we do actually have a lot of restrictions on gun ownership right now. You know, I carried an M4 every day, an M9, and I also carried a couple grenades. And you know what? I never blew myself up. I've used grenades. I've used them safely. I mean, for me at least. So I feel I feel perfectly comfortable with 2 grenades right on me right now. And I don't think, I mean, anyone would have to be nervous. But we've made a decision as a country that that's not safe. And so we are not allowed to carry grenades around. We're not allowed to carry anti-tank rockets around. So there are a lot of restrictions on firearms and weapons of war that we already have in place in the United States. And so this argument that passing a few more reasonable restrictions like the ones that we're trying to get passed through the House today will be the beginning of some slippery slope, I don't think is really fair. Because we actually have passed a lot of restrictions. There are a lot of reasonable restrictions that we all kind of agree on right now. And I think people often forget that perspective. Yes, sir.
Congressman, thanks so much for coming today. As you look ahead to the presidential election and the prospects that we're probably going to have a Congress that continues to be fractured, probably going to have a president with one of the lowest approval ratings in recent history, I'm wondering what you think is realistic for a domestic agenda for the next 2 years.
It's a good question. It's a really tough question. You know, obviously a lot depends on who's elected, because I think no one really. I mean, look, I'm very strongly anti-Trump, just to be out there, and there may be some Trump supporters out here. would hope not, but I just think he's truly dangerous for the country. But I think everybody in Washington, and frankly on both sides of the aisle, think that he's just so erratic they have no idea what he would do. And, that may not be what you hear from Republican press conferences when you're in the gym in the morning. That's what people are saying. So I think there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty there. If Secretary Clinton is the next president, then she has a really important decision to make about just what her legislative strategy will be. Some people look back on Obama's term and say, if he had started with something other than Obamacare, which proved so divisive, he might have been able to get 2 or 3 things done rather than just one. Other people say, look, the only way he could have possibly gotten this health care law passed is if he had made it his first and only priority. But it just illustrates the fact that I think that, she can come in sort of guns blazing with her own agenda and just push a few things through on the momentum of her win, and it won't get her very far. Or she could come in and say, I really want to bring Republicans in and work with them. And I think that we could do some reasonable things like tax reform. Tax reform is something that I think the majority of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle agree on probably 80% of what it would look like. There's another part that's tough, but I don't think passing tax reform is completely unreasonable. Would it be hard? Yeah. Would it take sacrifices on both sides that a lot of people wouldn't like? Yeah, sometimes that's the best sign of a good piece of legislation, is that there's something for everybody to complain about, because everybody's going to have to make sacrifices. Republicans will have to raise taxes on some people. Democrats will have to cut some mandatory spending. But if we can do that and get some actual progress on a real tax and budget deal, I think that would be significant for the country. What both candidates are talking about doing as far as sort of a big proposal is just infrastructure investment. And depending on how much you go into debt, you can certainly do that. Trump's economic plan would put the country in debt by $11.5 trillion. Now, Hillary's plan puts it in debt by $500 billion. So, neither of them are really realistically dealing with the massive budget deficit that we have. But all politics and partisanship aside, all the economic analyses of Trump's plan show that it will put the country into a recession. And I saw a presentation from Barclays recently, just the analyst presentation being floated around, and it sort of had, how bad the recession will be if Trump does what he wants, and then how bad will it be if Congress waters down his proposals, and it's still pretty bad. So there's a lot to be worried about there, and I think in the prospect of actually making any sort of long-term investments would be much harder under that kind of scheme. Yes. No kidding, is that right? Fantastic. My translator from Rock, yeah.
Senior high school at Andover. And I thought you might have a unique perspective on this, given that I know you helped him seek asylum while he was my teacher. First off, was he successful in the end, hopefully? And second off, given the migrant crisis going on in Europe and kind of the immigration problems that we're having here, from your perspective, is there something that should be massively changed in our immigration system?
Yes, yes, and yes. So Mohammed was at my parents' house with me and my brother's birthday this past weekend. So Sunday night, we all had dinner at my parents' house. My family, Mohammed, my sister, who is a proud BC grad, my brother-in-law, her husband, who's a proud BC grad. They met here. Actually lived on this campus where they met freshman year. And yeah, so he's not only here, he's very much like a part of our family. He comes for every Thanksgiving and Christmas and everything. He's doing really well. Getting him asylum was very difficult. This is a guy who was my translator. To complete, not complete, but the other part of the story about this media work that we did is Mohammed and I ended up having a TV show in Iraq, which is a very odd thing for an infantry officer of Marines to be doing. It proved very popular. I had to, not a single person here has asked for my autograph tonight. The Iraqis used to ask for it all the time. I mean, I used to get fan mail. I mean, this congressman gig is like way down here compared to being a minor celebrity in Iraq. But Mohammed, the point is that Mohammed was not only my translator, like many translators in Iraq and Afghanistan today. He was very, very, very public. I mean, he's literally on TV every day. And so he was threatened. His family was threatened. And he actually came to the U.S. on his own on a Fulbright scholarship to get his master's degree. But at that time, it was about 2006, 2007, the Civil War was just getting completely out of control. It would have been a death sentence for him to go back. So I helped him get asylum. But it was not easy. And I basically just, used my connections with a friend of my dad's or whatever to get Ropes and Gray to take on his case pro bono. And it took about a year to get his case through the system. The irony is that year I redeployed to Iraq for my fourth deployment. So Mohammed was living in my parents' house in my brother's old bedroom. So their son was in Iraq. They had an Iraqi son with them. But eventually he got asylum and he became an Arabic teacher at Andover. Actually, he would have had it by then. He subsequently got his green card because he had to get a work permit. He had to basically be approved for a work permit before he could do that. So he's a great example of a beneficiary of pro bono legal work. And yeah, our refugee system is pretty screwed up. And I was very vocally opposed to the governor's effort to stop Syrian refugees from coming to Massachusetts. Had a little bit of a war on Twitter with him. And fundamentally, look, refugees are refugees from the people we're fighting. Like, that's why they're refugees, right? That's why the Syrian refugees want to come here. We have the strictest vetting process for any traveler to the United States for our refugee program. So if you want to come as a terrorist, it's a lot easier to come on a tourist visa, to come just as a visitor. There are all sorts of ways to get to the United States, to come, walk across the border, lots of ways. The refugee program is like the most difficult. So if you look at the facts on this issue, it's something we absolutely should be doing. And I haven't even talked about the values. I haven't even talked about, the inscription on the base of the Statue of Liberty here. It's also something that's very important for our fight against terrorism. And so after I kind of battled the governor on this based on I actually started with the values. These are American values to accept these refugees from across the ocean. I remember going to the Holocaust Museum in Tel Aviv and just being so shocked. And being so shocked by just how America could turn away this ship in 1939 until this past year. And then I see, okay, this is exactly how it happens. Exactly how it happens. And we really haven't gotten all that much better. But after kind of waging this war based on values, where incidentally we were able to quite significantly change public opinion in Massachusetts, I then just wrote an op-ed in the Globe about the national security implications. And ISIS absolutely uses this kind of anti-refugee rhetoric in their recruiting efforts. I mean, they use Donald Trump in their recruiting efforts. And it makes it very hard to fight this fight on the ground in places like Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, if this is what we're doing back here at home. Not to mention the fact that it makes it much easier to radicalize people here already in America if this is the sentiment pervading our political process and in the country. So how many people watched the snooze fest on TV last night? A lot of people. When Governor Pence is up there saying these things, like that is, I mean, I think it's fundamentally un-American. It is also harmful to our national security. It absolutely increases the risk that we will have a homegrown terrorist attack when he says things like that. Yes?
Just last month, we hosted the Secretary of the Navy speaking about the difficulties when Congress doesn't pass a budget and the implications that has on national security.
Yeah.
So I would like you to speak to that issue.
I could tell a lot of things. I could talk a lot about the difficulties in Congress when the Secretary of the Navy does things without telling us, and that's a whole other story. So the Secretary of the Navy is not one of my best friends right now. But yeah, he's absolutely right, though, on this, is that, you know, I sit on the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee is supposedly one of the most important committees in Congress, but because we can't even pass a budget, it actually doesn't, you know, the Budget Committee, I like to say, is a good place for people who don't do math. So the budget process is quite broken. It is harmful to our national security. The Department of Defense can't plan ahead. I mean, they have their own issues with where the money is spent and what the priorities are. There's a lot of politicization of the defense budget from Congress to begin with. But the fact that they don't even know what sort of appropriations will be available for our ongoing efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, in Syria, for basic training back here in the States, for just making sure that pilots are getting the hours that they need to safely fly airplanes before they have to deploy overseas. This is a real problem. And it's an example of how the politics in Washington and the sort of the sport of politics that the Republicans and Democrats just play, you know, on the airwaves, is really harmful to guys out there risking their lives. And when the men and women on our front lines can't count on Congress to do its job, you know, there's a real problem. And I think that it's why we need more, frankly, more. We've never had fewer veterans in Congress in our nation's history than we do today. And I think that has an effect. Not all, I mean, there are veterans who play politics too. I mean, not all veterans are perfect, but I think that, you know, I find that it's a little bit easier to appeal to sort of like higher moral values when you're trying to get someone to do the right thing when it comes to a vote, if they have some experience of serving something larger than themselves in the past. So that's one of the reasons why I encourage a lot of national service veterans to run for office, even if they're, you know, even if they're Republicans. Yes, sir.
Before I begin, Mr. Congressman, I just want to thank you for being here and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
You spoke earlier about your bipartisanship, and a bipartisan effort that just went through Congress was JASTA, Justice Against Sponsored Terrorist Activities.
Mm-hmm.
And I just was looking through and I saw that you voted no to JASTA, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to just speak about why you said no and what you think the implications of JASTA being passed would be, both domestically and abroad.
Sure, sure. No, I appreciate you bringing this up. This was a politically very difficult vote to take, right? I mean, you can see the ads already. I mean, someone's making them, and you know, to run against me in 2018. You know, Seth Moulton sides with Saudi Arabia over 9/11 families, right? I mean, that's what people will say. There are a lot of tough votes that you take in Congress, and you think, you know, this is the right thing, but it will take 20 years for people to figure it out. I imagine that's the way a lot of Southerners who voted for civil rights back in the 1960s felt. You know, many of them probably lost their next elections and didn't come back to Congress, but at least their grandkids can look back and say, hey, my grandmother, grandfather took a tough vote. In this case, actually, it took about 12 hours for people to start saying, wow, this was a big mistake. And the worst irony was that, or not irony, but just sort of I don't know, just sort of disgusting lack of courage, was the Republicans in the Senate who came out and blamed the president for, quote, not explaining it well enough to us. It's just ridiculous. So the fact that the turning tail happened so quickly when people realized the implications that basically just, you know, busting the principle of sovereign immunity could have for our diplomats, our troops, our intelligence officials abroad is really significant. And look, this is pretty simple in practical terms, right? I mean, you guys know all the legal stuff, but like in practical terms, we want to sue Saudi Arabia because we think that they're responsible for 9/11. By the way, the intelligence is shaky on that, but okay, that sounds good. Well, what does Pakistan do to us when they say, you're killing our people with drones? That's terrorism. I mean, that you can totally understand how, from their perspective, that's terrorism as well, right? So this is it's a really dangerous piece of legislation. And a lot of people are asking now, well, what happens? You know, because so many people did vote to override the president's veto. I mean, what a great vote to take just before you go back to your district for your re-election, right? 97-1 in the Senate. That's pathetic. I mean, really pathetic. 77 of us in the House voted with the president. And by the way, it was not all Democrats. A lot of very thoughtful people, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and ranking member of the Armed Services Committee, a lot of people on the Intelligence Committee. I mean, people who really understood this voted to uphold the president's veto. There are only 2 people, House or Senate, from Massachusetts who voted for this. But I think people are already realizing that sort of error of their ways. What's going to happen now is people are, I mean, literally that night. So we voted on it, I think, that evening, and then the next vote was the CR later that night. And during the vote for the CR, folks were already distributing pieces of legislation to essentially pass to undo parts of JASTA. But you know, it's a good example of how when you're playing politics with our national security, it's really dangerous. Sir.
I've got, I guess, kind of 2 questions if I could quickly. One might be a little harder, one's kind of softball. Softball first, you've had 2 speakers of the House while you've been in Congress. We're about a year away, a little bit more than a year since Speaker Boehner resigned.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just mention maybe one thing that you've noticed that's been a big change between Boehner and Ryan.
Sure.
And then the second one, back to the no-fly, no-buy proposal. We, not to get very student, but we've talked about this in constitutional law about due process.
Yep.
And there are significant questions about how the no-fly list and the terrorism watch list work.
Right.
Ted Kennedy was on one of these lists.
Yep. Not true, but I'll explain why. Yep.
There are, there are plenty of people who work for the federal government that are on these lists,
Yep.
and no one knows what it means to get on them, how you get off, what the process is. So I guess my question is, can you defend that position a little bit on how
Sure.
you
Great
can
question.
limit a Second Amendment right with questionable due process?
Right. Right. So first of all, Boehner versus Ryan. There's a lot of nostalgia in the House right now for Speaker John Boehner. And that seems like maybe that would be a strange statement to make a year ago, but that's the way a lot of people feel, because basically Speaker Ryan's whole bid to be Speaker was essentially, I will listen a little bit more carefully to the Tea Party. I'll be a little bit farther right than Boehner. That was basically the whole premise of his speakership. And that's what he's done, and as a result, he's a little bit more controlled by the Tea Party. And so we're a lot less productive under Speaker Ryan than we are under Speaker Boehner, despite his pledge to be more productive, because the Tea Party shuts stuff down all the time. And they're already making noise about, unseating him as Speaker because he's not conservative enough or whatever. So he's just totally beholden to them. And so that's a sad change. Look, I disagree with Boehner all the time, and I certainly did not like everything he did. But he did, at the end of the day, really try to find compromise and do what's right for the country and for the Congress, not just what's right for his political party. And I think there's a little less of that today. On the due process considerations, so I'm a member of this of a group called the Bipartisan Working Group. It's an invitation-only group, 10 Democrats, 10 Republicans. We meet every single week on Capitol Hill. And when the Orlando shooting happened, some people were like, God, this is so contentious, we shouldn't even discuss it. And I said, no, this is exactly what we have a group like this for. And so one of the things we did, we had a pretty tough discussion one morning on this issue. And then we said, you know what, let's just try to understand the facts. So we had the FBI, Department of Justice, come in and give us a briefing on exactly how all these no-fly lists worked. And they spent a whole hour with the slides and everything, going through exactly what the process is to get on one list, to get on others. There's really 3 main different lists. And the processes for getting on and off them and switch from one to the other and whatnot are different. That presentation put a lot of minds at ease. It's actually very, very difficult to get on these lists. When you hear that Ted Kennedy was on the list, what actually happened is that someone with a very similar name to him was on the list, and he got flagged. Muhammad used to get flagged all the time trying to get on planes because it turns out some terrorists are named Muhammad. And so now I always said, look, if the TSA can't figure out that this guy, who is over there risking his life for our country is not a terrorist, how the hell are they going to find someone who actually is? But be that as it may, Muhammad would get flagged because his name is similar to one on the list. But as soon as they would just sort of question him and check his documents, he'd be fine. He'd be able to get on the airplane. So that is part of what has happened. And then people say, "Oh, I was on the list" or whatever. Well, that's actually not the case. The problem is that this stuff is classified, and so the actual processes and how many people are on which list and whatnot is classified. I don't fully understand why, other than just to, I think, so that terrorists don't know how people get on the list and therefore can try to figure out ways around it. I mean, I guess that's the obvious reason. But it's a real handicap in this debate, because I think a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans, came out of that briefing saying, geez, this is kind of silly that we can't get this stuff done. There are also due process provisions written into many of the bills, including my own, that are sitting before the House and the Senate today. Now, I am not a constitutional scholar. I have to rely on lawyers who work with me to tell me that they meet the constitutional standard for due process. But because of the concern that you just explained, many of the pieces of no-fly, no-buy legislation include additional due process considerations or provisions in the bills themselves. So, in summary, I think that we would find that the existing process meets due process, meets the constitutional standard. On top of that, many of the new pieces of legislation sort of double down on it. I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know if it's a good enough answer, but so why don't we just go 1, 2, 3.
Hi. Thanks again, Congressman.
That's good to be here. Thanks.
A question I had concerned something that I suppose would have a lot of bipartisan sympathies on both sides of the aisle. It seems like members of the House and Senate spend a great deal of their time fundraising. And I'm kind of curious if you could speak to the culture in terms of efforts to substantively reform the campaign finance system. We hear reports about like the toothlessness of the FEC and other regulatory bodies. What kind of burden does it take on members of the House, and what's been your experience?
Yeah, so I probably spend about 30% of my time fundraising, and there is a lot to do in this job. I mean, every 15 minutes of my day is scheduled. I had actually a rare, I think I was supposed to have 3 days off in the month of October, and I had one yesterday, and I got up at 5 in the morning, and I just worked the entire day, so it wasn't a day off, I just worked from home, right? So there's a lot to do. So if we didn't have to spend that 30% of my time fundraising, there's a lot more good work that we could actually be doing. I wouldn't be sitting at a beach or something. 30% is probably the lowest figure for any member of my class. There's maybe one other guy I can think of who actually does have someone running against him, but he's probably in a more safe seat than I am. Mine's actually, my district voted heavily for our Republican governor. So, so there's probably no one in the freshman class who fundraises less than I do, and I spend 30% of my time doing it. So it is a huge burden on our system, and not to mention all the inequities that come with it. I have never, ever taken a vote because some donor or some lobbyist or something told me this is how you should vote. No one has ever given me a check. Actually, one person was supposed to hold a fundraiser for me and asked me to do something, and I said no, and then we canceled the fundraiser. So I imagine that does happen. I've certainly never done it. But there's no question that just the influence of money in politics, I mean, the fact that these Republicans would lose so much support from the NRA and gun owners and everything with their political action committees if they voted for gun reform, that is a real drag in our process. And there absolutely are people who let it influence their votes. Yeah, in the back.
Congressman, thank you for coming. One of the things one of the early successes for ISIS was the fall of Mosul in 2014, the surrender of the Iraqi army and all of their weapons, facilities, and storage that they had there. That's continued to arm ISIS throughout this whole campaign. So, based on your experiences both in the Marines and in similar cities like Atmosphere and training alongside the Iraqi army and your experience in the House Armed Services Committee, I wonder if you could talk to what you think about the
Yeah, I think the withdrawal was horribly managed. But it was not so much what we like to talk about, which is the withdrawal of the troops. Because actually we had achieved a lot of military success during the surge. I mean, Iraq was a relatively stable place by 2011, 2009, sorry, 2010. The big mistake we made is that we didn't follow through on the political changes that needed to happen. In fact, Ambassador Crocker and General Petraeus came back from the surge and basically testifying before Congress said, we've achieved remarkable military progress during the surge. In fact, far exceeded our expectations, but we have not made the political progress that we need yet. And so a lot of people at the time called for a political surge. We built the largest U.S. embassy in the world in Baghdad because we knew the Iraqis needed this political mentorship. So I don't think it was necessarily a mistake to take the troops out. We probably should have left some. But the key is we needed to keep holding the hands of Iraqi politicians. We needed to have those advisors in the prime minister's office, in the ministries. Because what happened is Maliki, who was incredibly sectarian, about the worst prime minister you could imagine, just let the government completely run off, or ran the government completely off the rails. And so, as you just illustrated with this example, what happened was not that ISIS swept in and defeated the Iraqi army because they were poorly trained. The Iraqi army put their weapons down and went home because they'd lost faith in their own government. And so the underlying problem in Iraq today is political. And yet the president's response has been entirely military. So I just released an Iraq strategy, what I think we need to do in Iraq, that is heavily focused. It's an entirely political strategy, has some military components, but it's about what we need to do to not just win the fight against ISIS, but actually ensure peace and stability going forward so that we can take the troops home for good. Because the worst tragedy of Iraq today is that we're back there with 5,000 young Americans risking their lives, refighting the same battles that we already fought and won. Mosul, just the latest example. Fallujah, Ramadi before it. And that's just ridiculous. And if we don't do anything differently this time, because that's the question people should be asking. They should be, what's going to make this time different? If we don't do anything different, then, 5 years from now, we'll send a bunch of troops back to have to clean up the mess as it falls apart again. And, ISIS replaced Al-Qaeda, some other terrorist group will replace ISIS. So we have a lot of work to do on this front. The withdrawal was terribly managed. But the worst part is we're about to repeat the same mistakes with what we're doing right now. And by the way, all the presidential candidates are talking about is just how many more bombs they can drop. So they missed the point completely. In my strategy, I actually call for not going forward with the Mosul offensive until we can make some more political progress, which is a politically contentious proposal. But I'll tell you, it's getting a lot of support. General Petraeus, Secretary Albright, both have quotes on my website talking about the plan, the value of the plan. So if you have a second, go to just moulton.house.gov and look at this and see what you think. But now some people say, what is that the role of a member of the Armed Services Committee to put out a strategy for our military or a war overseas? And the answer is no, but I spent a year and a half knocking on the doors of the administration. Nothing. So I finally just said, you know what, I'm just going to put this out there and see if people will talk about it. And the good news is people are talking about it. Yes?
Good afternoon, Congressman, and thank you for being here. On the opposite side, given your service to our country, I assume that your constituents as well as special interest groups in Washington are very interested in what's security here domestically and what their approaches are. I guess my question is, what is the biggest issue that you hear coming up in terms of security here domestically, and what do you think it is? How do those conversations go in terms of addressing those concerns moving forward?
Well, terrorism is certainly on the forefront of everyone's minds. That's what people talk about. And the thing about terrorism is that if you actually look at your chances of dying of a terrorist attack here in America, they're exceedingly low. It is far more dangerous for you to walk out here and cross the street than it is for you to be worried about, getting a terrorist attack. You're far more likely to die from a limb falling from a tree than you are to get killed in a terrorist attack. But the reason why terrorism works is because it creates terror. Like that's it just does what it's supposed to do. And the risk to our country is not just that a bunch of people get killed in a terrorist attack, but that a bunch of people get killed and then we fundamentally change our laws, who we are as Americans, in response to that. And that's why I think terrorism is a great risk. That's why I think ISIS is a serious risk to our national security. Not just because of the number of people they could conceivably kill here in America or overseas, but because they're actually pretty effective at terrorism and scaring Americans into actually changing our laws, who we are as Americans, frankly, leading to a presidential race like you see on one half of the aisle in this election. So I think that is a great danger. And there is a lot that we need to do both at home and abroad. We've been quite successful since September 11th at preventing terrorist attacks by and large. But I think the growing threat is not from terrorists coming overseas, flying airplanes into buildings or something like that, although it still could occur. There's still people who would like to do that. It's the self-radicalization at home. And that's why this rhetoric on the presidential campaign trail is so dangerous. It really is. And it's hard to go and tell your neighbors, I know you're scared about this. I know you think foreigners do this stuff. I know you're scared of Syrian refugees or whatever else. But actually, by holding those opinions, you're putting yourself at greater risk.
We have time for one more.
One more, all right.